There's a certain kind of quiet that settles into a house after a storm, a stillness that feels heavier than silence. It's the quiet of things broken, of things washed away. My house has held that quiet for 15 years. It seeped into the floorboards the day my daughter, Clara, walked out, and it has lived in the spaces between the ticking of the grandfather clock and the hum of the old refrigerator ever since. I'm Eleanor, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived in this house in suburban Ohio for most of my life. It's where I raised Clara, where my late husband, Robert, and I dreamed of growing old together, watching our grandchildren play in the yard under the shade of the great oak tree he planted the year we were married. Robert left me too soon, a quiet departure from a heart that had simply worked too hard for too long. But Clara, her leaving wasn't quiet. It was a thunderclap that shattered the world I knew. Clara was my sunshine, a whirlwind of blonde hair, bright laughter, and ambitions that seemed to stretch as high as the summer sky. She wanted to be a designer, to live in a bustling city, to see her name in lights. I never once doubted she would achieve it. She had a fire in her, a relentless drive that I admired, even when it made her impatient with our small-town life. When she told me she was pregnant, the news was a surprise, but a joyful one. Her boyfriend, a fleeting romance from her early college days, was long gone, but we would manage. I would be there. I would help her. We would raise this baby together, and her dreams wouldn't have to die. They would just have a new, tiny spectator. Then Leo was born. My grandson. He was the most beautiful baby I had ever seen. He was perfect. But as the months turned into a year, then two, the quiet that now fills my house began to gather around him. He didn't babble like the other toddlers in the park. He didn't make eye contact or reach for a comforting hug. He would become transfixed by the spinning of a fan or the way light fractured through a glass of water. His world was one of intricate patterns and overwhelming sounds. The tantrums, which we later learned were sensory meltdowns, were terrifying. They were raw, primal screams of a little boy lost in a world that was too loud, too bright, too much. The diagnosis came when he was 3, autism spectrum disorder. The doctor was kind but clinical, handing us pamphlets filled with words like neurodivergent and lifelong condition. I took the pamphlets and read every single word, underlining sentences, making notes. I saw a path forward, a challenge to be met with love and patience. Clara just saw a wall. She saw the end of her dreams, the final, insurmountable obstacle between her and the life she felt she deserved. The fire in her eyes began to dim, replaced by a weary resentment that she aimed, with heartbreaking precision, at her own son. She started staying out later. "I just need a break, Mom," she'd say, her voice brittle. The breaks became longer. Weekends turned into long weekends. I'd find myself alone with Leo, tracing the patterns on the wallpaper with his small finger, humming the same lullaby over and over because it was the only thing that seemed to calm the storm inside him. I was becoming his primary caregiver, and a cold dread was beginning to pool in my stomach. I saw the distance growing in my daughter's eyes, a detachment that frightened me more than any of Leo's meltdowns. The day she left is burned into my memory like a brand. It was a Tuesday in April. The spring rains had been relentless. Leo, who was 5, had been having a difficult week. The constant drumming on the roof, the damp chill in the air, it all unsettled him. He'd had a particularly intense meltdown that morning, and Clara had locked herself in her room. I finally managed to soothe him to sleep in my arms, his little body exhausted from the sheer force of his own distress. I laid him in his bed, tucking his favorite blanket, a worn-out quilt with a pattern of interlocking squares, right up to his chin. When I came downstairs, Clara was standing by the front door with a single suitcase. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me, at some imaginary horizon where she was free. "I can't do this anymore, Mom," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I can't." I tried to reason with her. I begged her. I told her we would find more help, that it would get easier. I asked her how she could do this to him, to her own son. She finally turned to look at me, and what I saw in her eyes broke my heart into a million pieces. It was utter, desolate emptiness. "He's not like other kids," she said, and the words were like stones. "He'll never be normal. He'll never tell me he loves me. He just exists. And I'm suffocating. I love him, I do, but it's killing me. It's stealing my life. I have to go. I have to save myself." She didn't even say a proper goodbye. She just opened the door, stepped out into the rain, and pulled it shut behind her. I stood there, listening to her car engine start, and then fade into the distance, the sound swallowed by the rain. I was 57 years old, a widow, and suddenly the sole parent to a 5-year-old boy whose own mother had just abandoned him because he wasn't the son she had ordered from a catalog. I went back upstairs and stood in the doorway of his room. He was still sleeping, his face so peaceful, so innocent. A single tear escaped my eye and rolled down my cheek, hot with a mixture of rage and profound sorrow. I walked over to his bed, knelt down, and rested my head beside his. The storm outside had passed, and the quiet had begun to move in. It was no longer a house of bustling dreams and bright futures. It was a sanctuary. It was a fortress. It was just me and this little boy against a world that had already shown him its harshest side. I made a silent vow in that heavy silence, a promise to him, to Robert's memory, and to myself. I would not fail him. I would be his rock, his shield, his home. I would be enough. The road ahead looked impossibly long and lonely, but as I listened to the soft, rhythmic sound of my grandson's breathing, I knew I had no other choice. My life was no longer my own. It was his. The years that followed Clara's departure were a tapestry woven with threads of hardship and small, precious joys. The quiet in the house became our normal. It wasn't an empty quiet anymore. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the routines that gave Leo's world structure and safety. Our days were marked by schedules meticulously drawn on a large whiteboard in the kitchen. 7 a.m., wake up. 7:15 a.m., oatmeal with exactly 7 blueberries. 7:45 a.m., brush teeth, top row first. Each activity was a predictable step in a dance only we knew, a choreography designed to keep the chaos of the world at bay. I learned to speak Leo's language, a language not of words, but of patience, observation, and deep, unwavering presence. I learned that he did say, "I love you," just not with his voice. He said it when he'd gently take my hand and place it on his back for pressure during a difficult moment. He said it when he would, unprompted, bring me a perfectly shaped leaf he'd found in the garden, a small offering from his intricate world. Financially, it was a struggle. Robert's pension was modest, and my social security didn't stretch far. I took up mending and alterations for people in the neighborhood, my old sewing machine whirring late into the night. There were times I'd stand in the grocery aisle, my hand hovering between the brand name cereal and the store brand, doing the mental arithmetic of survival. I gave up my little luxuries, the weekly trip to the coffee shop, the new gardening books I coveted. None of it mattered. My purpose was singular, to provide a stable, loving environment for Leo. He was my entire world, and I was his. The school years were the hardest. I became a warrior in beige cardigans, attending countless meetings with teachers and principals who saw Leo as a problem to be managed rather than a mind to be understood. They complained he wouldn't participate in group activities, that he would become agitated during loud assemblies, that he would spend entire lessons staring at the patterns on the ceiling tiles. I fought for him. I explained sensory overload. I brought in articles. I advocated for a quiet space he could retreat to, for headphones to block out the noise. I was his translator, his defender, his fiercest ally. Some teachers listened. Others just saw a tired old woman making excuses for a difficult child. On those days, I'd come home, my heart heavy with frustration, and find Leo in his room, perfectly content, arranging his collection of stones in a complex spiral on his floor. Looking at him, my anger would dissolve, replaced by a fierce, protective love. The world might not understand him, but I did. His fascination with patterns evolved. From stones and leaves, it moved to the digital world. When he was 10, I used what little savings I had to buy him a used desktop computer from a pawn shop. It was a clunky, beige tower with a monitor that weighed a ton, but to Leo, it was a universe. He took to it with an intensity one had never seen before. He wasn't interested in games like other kids. He was interested in how it worked. He taught himself to code from old library books and free online tutorials. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard became the new heartbeat of our house. It was a language I didn't comprehend, a flurry of strange words and symbols that would fill the screen, but I understood the peace it brought him. The computer didn't judge him. It didn't demand eye contact. It responded to logic, to clear and precise commands. It was a world he could control. As a teenager, he was still quiet, still preferring his own company, but the agitated energy of his childhood had settled. It had been channeled into lines of code. He started building small programs for himself. A program that would organize his photos based on color gradients. A program that created calming, geometric patterns that would slowly morph on the screen. He was building the tools he needed, creating his own accommodations for a world not built for his mind. I watched in quiet awe. I didn't understand the technicalities, but I understood the creativity, the sheer brilliance of what he was doing. I was his support staff. I'd bring him glasses of iced tea and plates of sandwiches, which he would eat without ever looking away from the screen. I'd remind him to sleep. I'd sit in the chair in the corner of his room, reading a book, just being there, a silent guardian while he built his digital worlds. The idea for the app came to him when he was 17. He called it Pattern Flow. He tried to explain it to me one evening, his eyes brighter than I'd seen them in a long time. It was an app designed to help people like him, people with neurodivergence, organize their lives. It wasn't just a calendar. It integrated schedules with sensory inputs. It could learn a user's preferences, that fluorescent lights are distressing, that the sound of a lawnmower is a trigger, that a 15-minute break after a social interaction is necessary. It would create a flow for their day, a visual, pattern-based schedule that helped them navigate the world with less stress and anxiety. He was building a translator, not just for others to understand him, but for him to understand and manage the world. He worked on it relentlessly for a year. He used his own experiences, his own struggles, as the foundation. It was his life's work distilled into an elegant, intuitive interface. When it was finished, he uploaded it to the App Store. He set the price at a few dollars. Maybe it will help someone, he said, with a shrug. And it did. The first review came a week later. It was from a mother in Australia. For the first time, she wrote, "My son was able to go to the grocery store without having a meltdown. This app is not a tool, it's a lifeline." More reviews poured in. From the UK, from Canada, from all across the United States. They were emotional, grateful testimonials from parents, from autistic adults, from people with ADHD and sensory processing disorders. They all said the same thing. This app had changed their lives. The downloads grew from hundreds to thousands, then tens of thousands. A little money started trickling into our bank account, enough for me to stop my mending work and buy the good brand of coffee for the first time in a decade. It was wonderful, but it wasn't life-altering. We were happy. Leo had found his purpose. He was helping people. That was the real treasure. The life-altering moment came on a Thursday afternoon. The phone rang and I answered it, expecting it to be a telemarketer. But it was a man with a crisp, professional voice from a big tech company in California. He wanted to speak to Leo. I passed the phone to my grandson, who listened silently for a long time, his expression unreadable. He just nodded and said, "Okay," a few times. When he hung up, he looked at the phone for a moment, then turned to me. "They want to buy Pattern Flow," he said, his voice flat, as if he were reporting the weather. "Oh, Leo, that's wonderful," I said, my heart swelling with pride. "That's just incredible." He paused, processing. "They want to keep me on as lead developer," he added. Then another pause. "They offered a sum of money." "Well, don't keep me in suspense." I laughed. "How much?" He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, as if the number itself didn't quite compute. $3.8 million, he said. The quiet in the house was suddenly deafening. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, everything stopped. I sank into a kitchen chair, my hand over my heart. $3.8 million. The number was abstract, fantastical. It was more money than I could comprehend. I looked at my grandson, this brilliant, quiet boy who the world had written off, who his own mother had discarded. This boy who had taken his pain and his unique perception of the world and turned it into a multi-million-dollar lifeline for thousands of people. The tears I had been holding back for 15 years finally came, but they weren't tears of sorrow or anger anymore. They were tears of overwhelming, earth-shattering pride. My boy, my Leo, had not just survived. He had triumphed. And in that moment, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. We had made it. The weeks after the sale of Pattern Flow were a blur of surreal activity. Lawyers with glossy briefcases came to our small house, their expensive shoes looking out of place on my worn linoleum floor. Papers were signed, bank accounts were opened, and numbers with an impossible number of zeros appeared on statements. The first thing Leo did was pay off the mortgage on the house. The day I held the deed, free and clear, I cried. He then arranged for a contractor to fix the leaky roof, replace the drafty windows, and install a new, quiet furnace. He didn't want a new house. He wanted this house, our sanctuary, to be safe and comfortable. For me. His gestures were practical, logical, and more moving than any flowery prose could ever be. The money changed everything and nothing. I still got up at the same time. Leo still had his oatmeal with 7 blueberries. But now, when I went to the grocery store, I didn't have to check the prices. I bought the organic vegetables, the expensive cheese, the good cuts of meat. I filled our cupboards with a feeling of security that was so profound it was almost dizzying. Leo, for his part, seemed almost indifferent to the wealth. He bought a new, powerful computer and a comfortable ergonomic chair. That was it. His joy came not from spending the money, but from the work he was now paid handsomely to do. He worked remotely, communicating with his new team in California via video calls and encrypted messages. His bedroom, once a refuge from the world, was now a command center connected to it, but on his own terms. The news of Leo's success, as news in a small town does, traveled fast. It was in the local paper, a feature story about the hometown boy who created a revolutionary app. They called him a genius, a prodigy. They didn't mention the struggles, the lonely years, the quiet battles fought within the walls of this very house. They didn't mention the mother who was conspicuously absent from the story of his triumph. But she heard. Of course, she heard. The phone call came on a Sunday evening. I was in the garden, pulling weeds from around my prize-winning roses, feeling a contentment I hadn't known was possible. The phone rang, and I almost didn't answer it. When I did, the voice on the other end was hesitant, almost a whisper. Mom? 15 years. 15 years without a single call, without a birthday card for her son, without a Christmas letter. And now Mom, as if she had just called last week. A cold fury, an emotion I thought I had buried long ago, rose in my chest. I didn't speak. Mom? It's me. It's Clara. Her voice trembled slightly. I heard the news. About Leo. I saw it online. It's amazing. I'm so proud. Proud. The word was a slap in the face. Where was her pride when he was 5 years old and screaming because the texture of his socks was wrong? Where was it during the parent-teacher conferences when I was the only one there to defend him? What do you want, Clara? I asked, my voice flat and cold, devoid of the warmth she had once known. I want to see him, she stammered. I want to see you both. I've missed you so much. I made a mistake, Mom. A terrible, terrible mistake. I was young and stupid and scared. I've thought about you both every single day. Every single day. The lie was so audacious it almost made me laugh. I looked through the kitchen window and saw Leo at his desk, headphones on, completely absorbed in his world of logic and code. He was safe. He was happy. He was whole without her. My entire being screamed to protect him, to tell her to stay away, to let her live with the consequences of her choices. But a small, traitorous part of me, the part that was still a mother, felt a flicker of something else. A painful, foolish hope. He's busy, I said, stalling. Please, Mom. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to see my son. I'm in Cleveland. I can drive down tomorrow. I was tired. Suddenly, so very tired. The fight had gone out of me. Fine, I heard myself say. Tomorrow afternoon. The next day was the longest of my life. I didn't tell Leo she was coming. I didn't know how. How do you prepare someone for the return of a ghost? I just told him we were having a visitor. He nodded, accepting it as a change in the day's schedule. At 2 o'clock, a rental car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. My hands were trembling. I watched as she got out. This wasn't the vibrant, fiery girl who had left. This was a woman in her early 40s, with tired lines around her eyes and a sadness in her posture that her fashionable clothes couldn't hide. Life had not, it seemed, been the glamorous adventure she had run away to find. She walked up the path, and I opened the door before she could knock. We stood there for a moment, two strangers who shared a lifetime of history. "Mom," she breathed, and her eyes filled with tears. She moved to hug me, but I took a small step back. It was an involuntary reaction, of a reflex of a heart that had learned to shield itself. Leo chose that moment to come out of his room, heading for the kitchen for a drink. He stopped when he saw her. He tilted his head, the way he does when he's processing new information. He showed no sign of recognition, no shock, no emotion at all. "Leo," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Leo, look at you. You're so grown up." She took a step towards him, her hands outstretched. "It's me. It's your mother." Leo just looked at her. He scanned her face, his eyes moving back and forth as if memorizing a new dataset. The room was silent, thick with her desperate hope and my anxious dread. And then he spoke. His voice was calm and even. "I have a mother," he said, turning his head slightly to look at me. "Her name is Eleanor. She lives here." The words were not said with anger or resentment. They were stated as a fact. A simple, undeniable, logical truth from his perspective. The woman standing before him was a biological data point, nothing more. The role of mother in his life's operating system was already filled. Clara's face crumpled. The sob that escaped her was a raw, wounded sound. It was the sound of a person realizing, far too late, the true cost of what they had thrown away. She looked from Leo's impassive face to my weary one, and in that moment, she finally understood. There was no grand reunion to be had. There was no easy forgiveness waiting for her. She had not come back to a broken family that her presence would magically heal. She had come back to a family that had healed without her, that had grown stronger in the space she had vacated. I looked at my grandson, who had already turned his attention to the pattern of the light on the floor, his mind moving on to more interesting things. And I looked at my daughter, a woman broken by her own choices. I felt a pang of pity for her, but it was distant, like a memory of a pain long past. My anger was gone. My hope was gone. All that was left was the quiet truth. My family wasn't the picture-perfect image I had once dreamed of. It wasn't Robert and me and Clara and a gaggle of happy grandchildren under the oak tree. It was me and a quiet, brilliant boy. It was oatmeal with 7 blueberries and late nights with a whirring sewing machine and the rhythmic click of a keyboard. It was a life built not on what was lost, but on what remained. And what remained was stronger and more real than any dream she had ever chased. I walked over to Leo and put my arm around his shoulders. He leaned into me, a familiar, comforting weight. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full. It was, and always had been, enough. There's a common saying that you can't be haunted by a ghost you don't believe in. For 15 years, the ghost of my daughter, Clara, was a phantom I refused to acknowledge. She was a memory locked away in a dusty attic of my mind, a story I had no interest in rereading. But that day, standing in my living room, she was no longer a ghost. She was flesh and blood, weeping on the floor where her son used to lie and trace patterns in the carpet with his fingers. And the most haunting things I've learned are not the spirits of the dead, but the living who return to show you the gaping holes they left behind. Leo's words, "I have a mother. Her name is Eleanor," had not been a weapon. They were a statement of fact, a piece of data entered into his personal ledger long ago. But for Clara, they were a verdict, a final judgment on a life of choices she could no longer outrun. Her sob was a sound I hadn't heard since she was a little girl who had fallen and scraped her knee. It was a sound of pure, undiluted pain. A part of me, the hard, calloused part that had weathered 15 years of solitary struggle, wanted to tell her to get up and get out. It wanted to point to the door she had so easily walked through all those years ago and tell her to use it again. But then another part of me, the part that remembered changing her diapers and singing her to sleep, saw not the woman who had abandoned her child, but my own child, shattered on my floor. I was frozen, trapped between the ferocious instinct to protect my grandson and the ancient, buried instinct to comfort my daughter. Leo, having made his factual statement, seemed to consider the matter closed. He looked at the weeping woman on the floor with a detached curiosity, as one might observe a sudden downpour, before turning his gaze back to me. His expression was placid, but I could see the subtle shift in his posture. The disruption to the day's predictable flow was beginning to register. He needed the equilibrium restored. He needed me. That broke my paralysis. I put a hand on his back, a silent signal that I was there, that the world was still stable. Then I looked at Clara. "Get up," I said, my voice softer than I intended. It wasn't a command, but a plea from one exhausted woman to another. "You can't stay here like this." She looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and mascara, her eyes pleading for an anchor in the storm she had created. "I have nowhere to go," she choked out, the words muffled by her hands. I thought of the countless nights I had lain awake, worrying about where she was, if she was safe, if she was happy. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. She had a place to go. She was standing in it. She just didn't belong here anymore. I couldn't let her stay in the house. It was Leo's safe space, his sanctuary. Her volatile emotions, her very presence, were a contaminant to the sterile environment he needed to thrive. But I also couldn't turn her away completely. Looking at her, I saw the ghost of the determined, ambitious girl she'd been, now hollowed out by life. Her designer clothes were a costume that didn't quite fit, a mask for a deep and abiding failure. "There's a motel on the highway. The Maple Leaf Inn," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "Get a room. I'll call you later." It was a compromise, a buffer zone. It kept her close enough to be real, but far enough to be safe. She nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. She pulled herself up, using a chair for support, her body looking as weary as I felt. She didn't try to speak to Leo again. She just gave him one last, lingering look full of a universe of regret, and walked out the door, pulling it gently closed behind her. The quiet that returned was different this time. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with questions that had no easy answers. I turned to Leo, who was now calmly lining up the salt and pepper shakers on the dining table, creating a perfect, symmetrical pattern. He was restoring his own order. I wished it were that simple for me. That night, after Leo was asleep, I sat in the dark of my living room and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I allowed myself to think about Clara. I had spent so many years pushing her memory away, focusing only on the practicalities of raising Leo, that her story had become a two-dimensional caricature in my mind, the selfish daughter who ran away. But now her tear-streaked face was a third dimension I couldn't ignore. Where had she been? What had happened to the dreams she had sacrificed her son for? I called the motel. Her voice was small when she answered. I didn't ask for the whole story at once. I asked simple questions. Was she hungry? Did she have money? She answered in clipped, shame-filled sentences. The design career had never taken off. There had been a series of low-paying retail jobs, a string of failed relationships with men who were drawn to her initial fire but recoiled from the deep well of sadness behind it. She had lived a transient life, always moving, always searching for a happiness that remained just out of reach. She had never created a home because she had fled the only one she'd ever truly had. She began to come over for short, supervised visits. I laid down the rules like they were articles of a treaty. No sudden movements. No loud noises. No emotional outbursts. She had to enter Leo's world on his terms, not her own. It was painful to watch. She was a stranger in her own son's life. She would try to make conversation, asking him about school or friends, generic questions that had no relevance to his existence. He would either ignore her or give a one-word, literal answer before turning his attention back to his laptop. She tried to buy his affection, bringing him expensive gifts, a drone, a fancy watch. Leo would examine them with interest for a few minutes, figure out their mechanics, and then set them aside, returning to the familiar comfort of his keyboard. He didn't understand the transactional nature of her offerings. He couldn't see the desperate plea for love hidden inside the packaging. One afternoon, she brought over a photo album she had pieced together. It was full of pictures of her and a baby Leo. Clara laughing as she held him. Leo as a toddler on a swing. "Look," she said to him, her voice trembling as she opened it on the coffee table. "Look, this was us. We were happy." Leo looked at the pictures with the same dispassionate interest he'd shown the drone. He pointed to a picture of himself as a 2-year-old, a small frown on his face. "My shirt is wet in this picture," he observed. The fabric was probably uncomfortable. Clara stared at him, bewildered. She was showing him evidence of their love, and he was giving her a sensory analysis. She didn't understand that for him, the memory wasn't the laughter or the sunshine, it was the discomfort of the wet shirt. The past she was trying to reclaim was a past he had experienced in a completely different language. I started to act as a translator. "Clara, his world is literal," I'd explain quietly after Leo had left the room. "You can't talk to him about abstract feelings. You have to talk about patterns, systems, logic." I found myself teaching her the things I had learned through years of patient observation. I told her about his love for prime numbers, his aversion to the color orange, the specific hum of the refrigerator that he found calming. I was giving her the instruction manual for the son she had returned as a factory-sealed product. A part of me resented it deeply. This was knowledge I had earned through sacrifice and sleepless nights. Why should I just hand it to her? But another part of me knew that if there was any hope of a future, it had to be built on a foundation of understanding. She had to learn to see the boy who was actually there, not the one she wished he was. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came on a sweltering day in July. A thunderstorm was rolling in, the sky turning a bruised purple. The change in atmospheric pressure always unsettled Leo. He started pacing, his hands flapping slightly at his sides, a low hum beginning in his throat. It was the prelude to a sensory meltdown. Clara, who was there for one of her visits, froze. I saw the old fear in her eyes, the muscle memory of wanting to run. I was about to intervene, to guide Leo to his room, when Clara did something unexpected. She remembered something I had told her a few weeks prior. "Heavy pressure helps," I had said. "It makes him feel secure, grounded." She didn't rush at him. She didn't touch him. She slowly, deliberately walked over to the armchair where my heavy, hand-knitted Afghan was draped. She picked it up, her hands shaking, and approached him cautiously, as one might approach a frightened animal. "Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is heavy. Would this help?" She held it out. Leo stopped pacing. He looked at the blanket, then at her. He didn't speak, but he gave a short, sharp nod. He took the blanket from her, wrapped it tightly around his own shoulders, and went to sit in his chair, a visible wave of calm washing over him as the weighted pressure did its work. Clara stood watching, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. It was the first time she had successfully connected with him, the first time she had met one of his needs. She hadn't fixed him. She hadn't cured him. She had simply listened, learned, and offered a small piece of comfort. It was a tiny gesture, but in the quiet, broken landscape of our family, it was monumental. It was the first stone she had laid on the long, arduous path back home. Clara's small act with the weighted blanket was not a magic cure, but it was a beginning. It was the first time she had participated in Leo's world instead of trying to drag him into hers. The visits continued, but their texture began to change. She stopped trying to fill the silence with meaningless chatter and learned to simply sit in it. She would bring a book and read while Leo worked on his computer. Her presence became a quiet, consistent part of the background, less of a disruption and more of a new, ambient sound in the house, like a clock with a slightly different tick. She was learning the language of being present without being demanding. For Leo, consistency was a form of affection he could understand. Her showing up time and again, without expectation, was a pattern he could process. One evening, as I was washing the dinner dishes, Leo came and stood beside me. He was watching the water, a common habit, but I could sense he had something on his mind. "Grandma," he began, not looking at me. "Clara is my biological mother." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of a recently processed fact. "Yes, Leo." "She is," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He was quiet for a moment. "Her visits have a 93% rate of temporal consistency," he stated. "She says she will arrive at 2 o'clock, and her mean arrival time is 1:58. I smiled, drying my hands. Only Leo could quantify his mother's attempts at redemption into a statistical analysis. "She is trying, Leo," I said softly. He was silent again, processing this new variable. Then he asked the question I had been dreading for 15 years. "Why did she leave?" His voice was flat, devoid of accusation, but the question landed in my heart like a stone. He wasn't asking for emotional reasons. He was asking for data. The system of his life had a missing piece of code, and it was causing a logical error. He needed to resolve it. I had always shielded him from the painful truth, telling him simply that his mother had to go away for a while. It was a flimsy story that had held up during his childhood, but he wasn't a child anymore. He was a man who had built a multi-million-dollar empire on logic. He deserved a logical answer. I took a deep breath. "Leo, when you were little, the world was very overwhelming for you. Sounds were too loud, lights were too bright, and your feelings were too big. It was hard for you, and it was hard to understand. Clara was young, and she was scared. She didn't know how to help you. She felt like she was failing, and she made a choice. A wrong choice. She left because she didn't understand." I hated the words as they came out of my mouth. They felt like a weak excuse for an inexcusable act. But it was the truth, stripped of my own anger and resentment. It was the data he had requested. He absorbed this information without comment, his face unreadable. Then he simply nodded and walked back to his room. I didn't know if I had helped or hurt, but I knew I had been honest. I had given him the missing piece of the puzzle. It was up to him now to decide where it fit. A week later, Clara arrived for her now routine afternoon visit. I let her in and went to the kitchen to make tea. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of her voice, tentative and soft, coming from Leo's room. My heart leaped into my throat. She had never gone into his room before. It was an unspoken boundary. I crept to the doorway and peeked in. She wasn't intruding. She was standing just inside the door, and Leo was sitting in his chair, but he had turned it to face her. He was showing her his computer screen. "This is the base code for pattern flow," he was saying. "This module translates qualitative sensory data into a quantifiable scheduling variable." He pointed to a block of code. "This represents a user's aversion to crowded spaces. The app then reroutes their suggested travel path to avoid peak pedestrian traffic. It lowers the probability of a sensory overload event." He was showing her his soul, not in a poem or a song, but in lines of code. He was explaining the world that had driven her away, but he was doing it using the language he had invented to master it. Clara was listening with an intensity one had never seen in her. She wasn't pretending to understand the code, but she was understanding the meaning behind it. "So, you built this to make the world less scary?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "The world is not scary," Leo corrected her gently. "It is inefficiently organized. I created a more efficient organizational system." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't a tear of self-pity. It was a tear of profound, heartbreaking understanding. She was finally seeing him. Not the difficult child, not the autistic son, but the brilliant, logical, extraordinary mind that had navigated a hostile world and reshaped it to fit his needs. That evening, after Leo had gone to bed, Clara stayed behind. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat alone for so many years. "I was so wrong, Mom," she whispered, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. "I saw him as broken. I saw his autism as this terrible thing that had been done to me. I never once thought about what it was like for him. He wasn't broken. He was just different. And I was the one who was too weak to handle it. The confession was raw and unvarnished. There were no excuses, no justifications. It was the simple, ugly truth. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she continued, looking me in the eye. "And I certainly don't expect him to. I don't deserve it. But I want to be here if you'll let me. Not as his mother. I forfeited that right. But as something. I want to learn. I want to know him." I looked at my daughter, this woman who had caused me more pain than anyone on earth. The anger I had carried for so long had finally, quietly dissolved. It had been replaced by a deep, aching sadness for all the years we had lost, for the relationship she had thrown away and was now so desperately trying to rebuild from the rubble. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cold. "One day at a time, Clara," I said. "That's how Leo lives. And that's how we'll have to do this, too. One day at a time." A fragile smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from her since she'd returned. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the 15 years of silence. But it was a start. The next Sunday, I sat 3 places at the dinner table. It felt strange, audacious even. When Clara arrived, she saw the 3rd setting and her breath hitched. She didn't say anything, but her eyes welled up. Leo came to the table and sat in his usual spot. He looked at the 3 plates, the 3 sets of silverware. He processed the new pattern. Then he unfolded his napkin and placed it in his lap, a simple, accepting gesture. The quiet in the house was still there, but it was changing again. It was no longer the quiet of absence or the quiet of cautious tolerance. It was the quiet of 3 separate people, 3 broken pieces of a family, sitting together in the same room, tentatively, painstakingly, learning how to be whole again. The future was unwritten, a blank page. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt as though we might just have enough ink to write a new story. The setting of a 3rd plate at my dining table became our new ritual. It was a silent acknowledgement of a change that none of us dared to speak about too loudly, for fear it might shatter. Those Sunday dinners were a delicate performance. Clara would arrive, always on time, bringing a small offering, a pot of flowers for the garden. A special kind of tea she'd read was calming. She spoke when spoken to, her voice soft, her presence unobtrusive. She was a guest in the life she had created and then abandoned. She learned to watch Leo, to anticipate his needs without making a show of it. She learned that he organized his peas in a row before eating them, that he disliked the sound of forks scraping on the plate, and that if you asked him a question while he was processing another thought, his mind would stall like an overloaded computer. She was not just learning about her son. She was studying him, with the focus of a scholar deciphering a lost and sacred text. I watched it all from a place of cautious neutrality. I was the bridge between 2 continents, one of quiet, ordered logic and one of messy, remorseful emotion. My role had shifted. I was no longer just Leo's protector. I was now the facilitator of a fragile peace. During the week, my life continued its comfortable new rhythm. The financial security Leo's app had provided was a balm on my old worries. I joined a book club. I took a pottery class. I spent hours in my garden, not because I needed the distraction, but because I purely enjoyed the feeling of the sun on my back and the earth on my hands. For the first time in 15 years, I had the space to simply be Eleanor, not just Leo's grandmother and sole guardian. The weight on my shoulders had not vanished, but it was being shared, even if the person sharing it was the one who had put it there in the first place. One afternoon, Clara asked if I would go for a walk with her. We went to the local park, the one I had taken her to as a child, the one I had later taken Leo to, where he had ignored the other children in favor of studying the intricate patterns of a spiderweb. We sat on a bench overlooking the duck pond. For a long time, we just watched the ducks. "I found a small apartment to rent," she said finally, her eyes fixed on the water. "It's a few blocks from here. I'm starting a job next month." I turned to look at her, surprised. "A job?" I thought. I trailed off. I had assumed she was living off some savings, or that she would eventually ask for money. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can't take any more from you or from him. This is something I have to do on my own." She explained that she had been volunteering at a local community center that ran a support group for parents of newly diagnosed neurodivergent children. Her personal story, told with brutal honesty, had resonated with them. They had offered her a paid position as a parent advocate. Her role would be to talk to families, to share resources, to be the person she had so desperately needed and run from all those years ago. "I can't give them answers," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can tell them they're not alone. I can tell them not to make the same mistake I did. I can tell them to look at their child, to really look, and to find the person who is there, not the one they expected." In that moment, sitting on that park bench, I saw a glimpse of the woman Clara could have been, the woman she was now fighting to become. She was taking the single greatest failure of her life and trying to turn it into a source of strength for others. It wasn't about erasing her past, it was about atoning for it through action. She wasn't running anymore. She was planting roots in the very soil she had scorched. "Leo's money," she said, looking at me directly. "The money from the app. I know it's his, but if he's willing. I want to use some of it to create a proper foundation. Not for me. To fund the center. To provide free diagnostic services, to buy sensory equipment for schools, to create scholarships for educators specializing in special needs. To call it the Pattern Flow Foundation." She wasn't asking for a handout. She was presenting a business plan for redemption. "His pain built that app," she whispered. "It feels right that his success should be used to ease the pain of others." That night, I presented the idea to Leo. I laid it out for him logically as a proposal. I explained the function of the foundation, its goals, its intended outcomes. He listened, his head tilted, processing the data. He didn't focus on the emotional aspect of his mother's atonement. He focused on the system she was proposing. The allocation of capital to underserved communities has a high probability of positive societal impact, he concluded. The logic is sound. It is an efficient use of the resource. He opened his laptop, brought up a spreadsheet, and began to model the financial projections. For him, it was a problem to be solved, an elegant system to be designed. For me, watching him, it was a moment of profound, quiet grace. He was, in his own unique and logical way, helping to heal the wound he hadn't even fully understood. The foundation was established. Clara poured all of her energy into it. Her work gave her a purpose that had nothing to do with fame or glamour and everything to do with service. Her life was no longer about what she could get, but about what she could give. She was still a guest at our Sunday dinners, but the dynamic had shifted again. There was a new respect in the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that came from meaningful work. She and Leo found a new way to communicate. She would tell him about the logistical challenges at the foundation, how to efficiently schedule therapy sessions for 50 children, how to design a sensory-friendly waiting room. He would offer brilliant, logical solutions, sometimes sketching out complex diagrams on a napkin. They were connecting, not over shared memories or emotional effusions, but over a shared goal, creating order out of chaos. One Sunday evening, months later, I was cleaning up after dinner. Clara was about to leave. Leo was at his computer in the living room, a rare occurrence for him to be out of his room after a meal. "Clara," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. She stopped at the door, her hand on the knob. "Yes, Leo," she asked, her heart, I'm sure, in her throat. He didn't turn around, but he swiveled his monitor slightly so she could see it. On the screen was the interface of his Pattern Flow app. He had created a new contact profile. It read, Clara, biological mother. Beside it was a series of data points. Visit consistency, 98.7%. Emotional volatility index, low. Role, director, the Pattern Flow Foundation. Status, integrated into Sunday routine. He had given her an official place in his system. He had defined her. It wasn't the warm, fuzzy title of mom that she had once craved, the one she had forfeited. It was something far more meaningful. It was a designation granted by him, on his terms, in his language. It was logical. It was factual. It was acceptance. Clara stared at the screen, her body trembling. She didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, a deep, shuddering breath escaping her lips. She looked at me, and her eyes were shining with a light I hadn't seen in 20 years. It wasn't the fire of ambition, but the steady glow of peace. She gave me a small, grateful smile and left. I stood there in the quiet house, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clicking of Leo's keyboard. The ghosts were gone. The heavy silence had lifted. The quiet that remained was gentle, a comfortable blanket woven with the threads of our strange, imperfect, resilient life. I walked to the window and looked out at the old oak tree my Robert had planted so long ago. The future I had once pictured playing out under its branches was gone, a faded photograph from another life. But a new picture had taken its place. It was a picture of a brilliant young man building worlds on a screen, a woman finding redemption by helping others, and an old woman finally at peace in her garden. The storm had passed long ago, and in its wake, against all odds, something new had grown. Something quiet, something strong. Something that looked remarkably like home.